Am I the A for abandoning my boyfriend after he went through a severe health crisis and his child was diagnosed with HIV? I am Ellen, a 53-year-old woman who has seen a fair share of life's ups and downs. My story intertwines with Richard's, a 62-year-old man whose presence in my life brought both joy and complexity. Our paths crossed in the spring of 2005, at a charity event that neither of us had any real interest in attending but did so out of a sense of duty. It was one of those evenings filled with polite conversations and superficial exchanges, the kind that leaves one wondering why they bothered to attend. Amidst the mundane chatter and clinking of wine glasses, Richard and I found ourselves repeatedly reaching for the same appetizers at the buffet table. What started as light-hearted banter over the shrimp cocktail turned into a deeper conversation. Richard's laugh was hearty and infectious, and it drew me in. His hair, a mix of black and gray, framed a face that seemed to carry both wisdom and weariness. There was something comforting about his presence, something genuine in a room full of pretense. Our initial connection was rooted in shared interests. We both had a deep appreciation for jazz and a love for classic films. Our dates often involved long walks through the park, where we'd talk about everything from the nuances of a Miles Davis track to the intricate storytelling in Fellini's films. Richard was a widower who spoke of his late wife with a tenderness that resonated with me. It was clear that he had loved deeply and lost profoundly, a fact that made him all the more endearing to me. I had been divorced for over a decade by then, and while the scars from that relationship had mostly healed, they left behind a cautious heart. My marriage had ended in a painful and drawn-out process, filled with emotional upheavals and legal battles that took their toll on me. The experience had made me wary of opening up to anyone again. I had built walls around my heart, convinced that vulnerability would only lead to more pain. Trusting someone else seemed like an insurmountable risk, and I had resigned myself to a life of solitude, finding solace in my independence and self-reliance. When I met Richard, I was not looking for love. In fact, I was content with my single life, focusing on my career, my hobbies, and my close-knit group of friends. Richard, however, had a way of gently easing into my life, his presence unassuming yet steadily becoming a fixture. He understood loss in a way that resonated with me deeply. As a widower, he had faced his own profound grief and loneliness, and this shared understanding of loss became a foundation for our connection. Richard's approach to our budding relationship was marked by patience and kindness. He never rushed me or pushed for more than I was ready to give. Instead, he offered a steady, reassuring presence that slowly chipped away at my reservations. His gentle demeanor and the genuine warmth he showed me began to erode the walls I had built around my heart. Our early days together were filled with simple, quiet moments that brought us closer. We spent long afternoons walking in the park, sharing stories about our pasts, our hopes, and our fears. Richard had a knack for making me laugh, his sense of humor lightening the heaviness that sometimes weighed on my spirit. We discovered a shared love for jazz and classic films, spending evenings listening to records or watching old movies. These shared interests created a sense of companionship that felt both comforting and natural. Richard's empathy and understanding played a crucial role in building my trust. He never dismissed my past or the pain I had endured. Instead, he listened, offering support without judgment. When I spoke about my divorce, the betrayal, and the heartache, he would hold my hand, his presence a silent assurance that he was there for me. This empathy made it easier for me to open up, to let go of some of the fears that had held me back. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, our relationship grew stronger. We found comfort in each other's company, creating a rhythm that felt right. Richard's understanding of my need for space and his respect for my boundaries made all the difference. He knew when to give me room and when to offer a comforting embrace. This balance allowed our bond to deepen in a way that felt safe and secure. Our companionship became a source of strength for both of us. For Richard, I provided a new chapter of connection and care after the loss of his wife. For me, Richard became a partner who understood my cautious heart and honored it. Together, we navigated the complexities of our pasts, finding joy in the present and hope for the future. Richard's consistent kindness and our shared moments of joy slowly healed the lingering wounds from my previous relationship. I found myself looking forward to our time together, feeling a sense of peace and happiness that I hadn't felt in years. The cautious heart that once dominated my emotions began to soften, replaced by a growing love and trust for Richard. However, Richard's health was always a looming concern. He had chronic health issues, including hypertension and diabetes, which required careful management. Despite this, I was ready to stand by him, prepared to face whatever challenges came our way. My love for him was deep and unwavering, and I envisioned a future where we could navigate his health concerns together, offering each other support and companionship. In the early years of my relationship with Richard, our bond grew strong, nourished by shared interests and mutual understanding. Richard, at 62, had already faced significant health challenges, including hypertension and diabetes. Despite these issues, his zest for life was infectious, and it was this enthusiasm that drew me to him. At 53, I was acutely aware of the potential difficulties that lay ahead, but my commitment to Richard was unwavering. As time went on, the topic of marriage naturally arose. For me, marriage symbolized a formal commitment, a way to legally and publicly affirm the bond we shared. I imagined a future where we would navigate life's challenges together, with the security that marriage provides. Richard, however, had a different perspective. Having been through a bitter divorce, he was hesitant to remarry. His primary concern was to ensure that his estate would go to his children without any complications. He believed that our love did not need a legal stamp to validate it. I understood Richard's concerns and respected his desire to prioritize his children's inheritance. However, I also needed to protect my own interests. I made it clear that while I was willing to support him and stand by his side, I would not make the same sacrifices a wife might without the legal acknowledgement of marriage. This was not about mistrust but about ensuring that my contributions and sacrifices were recognized and valued. During one of our more serious conversations about the future, I proposed a compromise. I suggested that he make me his medical power of attorney, which would allow me to make decisions on his behalf in case of a medical emergency. Additionally, I requested the right to continue living in his house if I outlived him. These requests were reasonable, considering the level of care and support I was providing. However, Richard declined, not wanting to complicate matters for his children. Despite these unresolved issues, our relationship continued to thrive. I took pride in maintaining my financial independence. I purchased a condo and rented it out, ensuring I had a steady income stream. This decision was a practical one, allowing me to support Richard without compromising compromising my own financial stability. It was important to me that I remained self-sufficient, even as I devoted much of my time and energy to our relationship. The more we talked about our future, the more I realized the complexities of balancing love with practical considerations. I had always believed in the importance of mutual respect and support in a relationship. Richard's reluctance to marry, and his refusal to grant me any formal recognition made me question the depth of his commitment. While I understood his reasons, I couldn't help but feel a sense of disappointment. I wanted to believe that our love was strong enough to overcome these obstacles, but the reality was more complicated. Over time, I learned to accept the limitations of our relationship. I focused on the positive aspects, our shared interests, our deep conversations, and the companionship we provided each other. I found solace in the fact that, despite our differences, we had built a meaningful connection. However, the underlying tension about our future and the unresolved issues regarding our commitment always lingered in the background. It happened about 6 months ago. Richard, my boyfriend of 15 years, suffered a transient ischemic attack, TIA, often referred to as a mini-stroke. The event was sudden and terrifying, sending a shockwave through the comfortable routine we had established over the years. It was a typical evening. Richard and I were enjoying a quiet night at home. We had just finished dinner and were sitting in the living room, him reading the newspaper and me with a book. Suddenly, Richard slumped in his chair, his face contorted with pain. His speech became slurred, and his right arm went limp. Panic gripped me as I realized something was terribly wrong. My immediate fear was that he was having a full-blown stroke. I acted quickly, dialing 911 with trembling hands. The dispatcher assured me that help was on the way, but those minutes felt like an eternity. I held Richard's hand, trying to comfort him while silently praying for the ambulance to arrive. When the paramedics finally came, they moved with practiced efficiency, loading Richard onto a stretcher and into the ambulance. I followed them to the hospital, my heart racing with fear and worry. At the hospital, Richard was taken into the emergency room for immediate evaluation. I was left in the waiting area, filled with anxiety and uncertainty. The sterile environment, with its harsh fluorescent lights and the incessant beeping of medical equipment, only heightened my distress. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as I waited for any news about Richard's condition. Then, his daughter and ex-wife arrived. His daughter, whom I had always found somewhat distant, immediately took charge. She approached the nurses, demanding updates on her father's condition. Her mother, Richard's ex-wife, followed closely behind. Their presence added an unexpected layer of tension to an already fraught situation. They barely acknowledged me as they marched straight into the emergency room. A nurse soon approached me, conveying a message from Richard's daughter. They wanted to be alone with him. They insisted on being together as a family during this critical time, effectively pushing me aside. Despite my protests, I was asked to leave the room. The nurse, although sympathetic, explained that it was best to respect their wishes. Standing in the hallway, I felt a mix of anger, frustration, and profound sadness. I had been the one to call the ambulance, the one who had rushed him to the hospital, yet here I was, excluded from the room, cast aside by the very people who had not been there when it mattered. It was a stark reminder of my unofficial status in Richard's life, despite our deep connection and years of shared experiences. I paced the hallway, trying to process my emotions. The exclusion stung deeply, highlighting the fragile and uncertain nature of my role in Richard's life. I had been his partner for 15 years, but in this critical moment, I was treated as an outsider. The emotional impact of being marginalized by his family was significant. I felt like I was invisible, my contributions and care disregarded. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor finally emerged with an update. Richard's condition had stabilized. The TIA had been a temporary blockage of blood flow to the brain, a warning sign of potential more severe issues in the future. He would need to stay in the hospital for further observation and treatment. Relief washed over me, tempered by the exhaustion and emotional strain of the day's events. As Richard's daughter and ex-wife continued their vigil inside the room, I remained outside, grappling with my feelings. The hospital staff, seeing my distress, offered kind words and gestures, but it did little to alleviate the sense of alienation I felt. I spent the night in the waiting area, refusing to leave until I could see Richard myself. The following morning, Richard's daughter stepped out to get coffee. Seizing the moment, I quietly entered Richard's room. He was lying in bed, looking frail but conscious. When he saw me, his eyes softened with relief. I sat beside him, holding his hand, and we talked in hushed tones. He apologized for his daughter's behavior, but the damage was already done. The sense of exclusion and marginalization I had experienced could not be easily undone. After a brief visit, I was asked to leave again as his daughter returned. The emotional turmoil of the previous night replayed in my mind as I drove home. I felt a profound sense of betrayal and disillusionment. Despite my dedication and care, I had been treated as though I didn't belong. The drive home was long and silent, each mile filled with heavy thoughts. Once home, the familiar surroundings felt strangely alien. The events at the hospital had created a rift, making our shared space feel less like a haven, and more like a reminder of my uncertain place in Richard's life. I spent the day reflecting on our relationship, questioning my future with him. The following days were filled with routine hospital visits. I continued to bring Richard his favorite books and snacks, trying to provide comfort and normalcy. Our conversations were strained, overshadowed by the recent events. Richard was visibly troubled by his daughter's actions, but there was little he could do to change the dynamics of his family. One afternoon, during one of my visits, I found myself alone with Richard. We talked about the future, and I reiterated my desire to be included in his medical decisions and living arrangements. Richard, though sympathetic, remained firm in his stance. He did not want to complicate matters for his children. His refusal, though understandable, left me feeling unvalued and unsupported. Richard's condition slowly improved, and he was eventually discharged from the hospital. The drive home was filled with an uncomfortable silence. As we pulled into the driveway, I knew a difficult conversation awaited us. Over a cup of tea in the kitchen, I told Richard about my decision to move out. His reaction was a mix of disbelief and sorrow. He understood my reasons but pleaded with me to reconsider. I explained that while I loved him deeply, the events at the hospital had highlighted the limitations of our relationship. I needed to prioritize my own well-being and security, something I had neglected in my effort to support him. Richard listened, his expression a mix of regret and sadness. He apologized for the actions of his family, but the damage had been done. My mind was made up. Packing my belongings was a painful process. Each item I placed in the box felt like a piece of our shared history, a reminder of the life we had built together. The sense of loss was overwhelming, but I knew that this was the right decision for my own well-being. I moved into my condo, finding solace in the familiar surroundings and the sense of independence it provided. In the months that followed, Richard experienced more TIAs and was eventually unable to work. I struggled with feelings of guilt and sadness, questioning whether I had made the right decision. However, I also felt a sense of relief, knowing that I had reclaimed my autonomy and ensured my own stability. I continued to support Richard from a distance, ensuring that he had the care he needed. However, the dynamics of our relationship had fundamentally changed. However, I was wrong. Richard's daughter, Susan, had always been a complicated figure in our relationship. Though I had never had any major confrontations with her before, I had always sensed a certain animosity from her. She was in her mid-30s, a striking woman with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. Susan had never fully accepted me into her father's life, always keeping me at arm's length, but her actions following Richard's TIA revealed a side of her that I hadn't seen before. A few weeks after I moved out, my phone rang late one evening. It was Susan. I answered, expecting a civil conversation at the very least. Instead, her voice, filled with venom, erupted on the other end of the line. She accused me of abandoning her father in his time of need, calling me selfish and heartless. Her words were a barrage of insults, each one sharper and more hurtful than the last. She claimed I had left because I couldn't handle the responsibility and that I had never truly cared for him. The conversation was short, but the impact was lasting. Her accusations were not just painful, they were deeply unfair. Susan's anger seemed to stem from a belief that I had somehow betrayed her father, but I knew the truth was more complex. When I left, I believed that it might be easier for her to take care of Richard without feeling like she had to compete with me for his attention. I thought she would welcome the opportunity to step up and take on a more significant role in his care, but her reaction suggested otherwise. The conversation left me shaken and doubting my decision, even though I knew deep down that I had made the right choice for myself. Despite the hostility from Susan, I continued to care for Richard from a distance. I called regularly to check on him and coordinated with his caregivers to ensure he had everything he needed. But Susan's words lingered in my mind, casting a shadow over my actions and making me question my motives. One night, about a month after that call, I was on my way to buy groceries. It was late, around 11 p.m., and the streets were quiet. As I walked past a local bar, I noticed someone familiar slipping inside. It was Susan. I was taken aback. Richard's condition required constant attention, and I couldn't help but wonder why she was at a bar instead of at home taking care of him. Curiosity and concern battled within me as I stood there, contemplating what I had just seen. I continued my errands, but the image of Susan entering the bar stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. If Susan was out drinking late at night, who was looking after Richard? This question gnawed at me, and I felt a growing sense of unease. Had I been wrong to trust that she would take care of him in my absence? The thought that Richard might not be receiving the care he needed was troubling. The next day, I decided to call Richard's nurse to get an update on his condition. The nurse assured me that Richard was stable and that he was receiving the necessary care. However, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Susan's late-night outing had planted a seed of doubt in my mind. Was she as committed to her father's well-being as she claimed to be? The incident made me question everything I thought I knew about her. As the weeks went by, I tried to focus on my own life, but the sense of guilt and worry persisted. I continued to check in on Richard, and each time, I made sure to ask about his care and well-being. The responses were always positive, but Susan's behavior continued to trouble me. I began to realize that her anger towards me might not have been just about my leaving. There seemed to be more to her story, and her actions hinted at a deeper complexity. One afternoon, I could no longer contain my growing concern for Richard's well-being. Susan's erratic behavior and frequent absences had become too troubling to ignore. Deciding that a direct confrontation was necessary, I picked up the phone and called her, requesting a meeting. To my surprise, Susan agreed without much resistance, and we arranged to meet at a local cafe the following day. As I walked into the cafe, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Susan was already seated at a small table near the window, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. She looked up as I approached, her expression a mixture of wariness and irritation. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the conversation ahead, and slid into the chair opposite her. "Thank you for meeting with me, Susan," I began, trying to keep my tone calm and neutral. She nodded curtly, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you want, Ellen?" I decided to address the issue head on. "I saw you at the bar the other night," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'm concerned about the times you're away, and how it affects your father's care." Susan's eyes widened in surprise, and then her expression shifted to one of defensiveness. "I'm allowed to have my own life," she snapped. "I need a break from the stress of taking care of my father. You don't understand how hard it is." Her response, while reasonable on the surface, did little to alleviate my concerns. "I understand that everyone needs a break," I replied gently, "but Richard's condition requires consistent care. What arrangements are in place when you're not there?" Susan's agitation grew, and she leaned forward, her eyes flashing with anger. "Are you spying on me now? Trying to undermine everything I do? I'm doing the best I can, and you have no right to question me." I tried to remain calm, even as her accusations stung. "I'm not trying to undermine you, Susan. I just want to make sure Richard is getting the care he needs. I'm worried about him." "You're always worried," she spat, her voice rising. "But you're not here day in and day out dealing with all of this. It's easy for you to sit back and judge." The conversation was rapidly spiraling out of control. I could see that my questions were only fueling her anger, but I couldn't walk away without addressing my concerns. "Susan, please try to understand. This isn't about judging you. It's about ensuring that Richard is safe and well cared for." She glared at me, her face flushed with anger. "You think you know everything, don't you? You think you can just waltz in and fix things? Well, you can't. You don't know what it's like to be in my shoes." Her words cut deep and I felt a surge of frustration. "I'm not trying to take over, Susan. I just want to help. We both care about Richard, and we need to work together." But my words fell on deaf ears. Susan stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'm done here," she snapped. "Stay out of my way, Ellen. You're not helping anyone." With that, she stormed out of the cafe, leaving me sitting there, stunned and disheartened. The conversation had ended abruptly, with no resolution and more questions than answers. I stared down at the table, feeling a mix of frustration and helplessness. I had hoped that a direct confrontation would clear the air and lead to a constructive solution, but it had only served to deepen the divide between us. As I left the cafe, I couldn't help but replay the conversation in my mind. Susan's defensiveness and anger were understandable. understandable to some extent, given the immense pressure she was under, but her refusal to discuss Richard's care arrangements left me deeply concerned. I worried that her stress and frequent absences were putting Richard at risk. In the days that followed, I continued to wrestle with my feelings. I loved Richard deeply, and the thought of him not being properly cared for was unbearable. Yet Susan's reaction made it clear that my involvement was unwelcome. I was caught between my desire to ensure Richard's well-being, and the reality that my presence was creating more conflict. One evening I decided to visit Richard unannounced. I needed to see for myself how he was doing. When I arrived at his house, I was greeted by one of his caregivers, who seemed surprised but not displeased to see me. I found Richard in his room, sitting in his armchair and reading a book. He looked up and smiled when he saw me, his eyes lighting up with a warmth that melted away some of my anxiety. We talked for a while, and I asked him about his care. Richard assured me that he was being well taken care of, but there was a hint of sadness in his voice. He missed our time together, and I could see the strain that Susan's presence was causing him. It became clear that while he appreciated her efforts, the dynamic between them was fraught with tension. As I left that evening, I felt a renewed sense of resolve. I decided to maintain my distance but remain vigilant. I continued to check in regularly with Richard's caregivers and ensured that they had my contact information in case of any emergencies. I also made a point to visit Richard more often, making sure to coordinate with his caregivers so as not to disrupt his routine. The months that followed were challenging. Susan's hostility towards me did not abate, and each interaction with her was strained. However, my visits with Richard brought a measure of peace to both of us. He appreciated my efforts, and I found comfort in knowing that I was still able to contribute to his well-being in some capacity. On one particularly cold afternoon, I decided to visit Richard unannounced. As I approached the house, I heard raised voices coming from inside. It was unmistakably Susan, her tone sharp and accusatory. I paused at the door, hesitant to enter but compelled by concern. I strained to hear the words exchanged but could only make out fragments of the argument. "I'm tired of this," Susan's voice rang out, filled with frustration. "You're not doing your job properly. You're fired." The front door swung open and Richard's caretaker emerged, her face flushed and eyes downcast. She almost collided with me as she hurried out. I reached out to stop her, gently placing a hand on her arm. "What happened? Why are you leaving?" I asked, genuinely concerned. She looked up at me, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. It's nothing. Just a misunderstanding," she muttered, shaking her head sadly before continuing down the walkway. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. I stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. Susan had fired the caretaker, a woman who had been providing diligent care for Richard. My heart sank. I knew I had to go inside and check on Richard, but I also felt an increasing unease about Susan's actions and their impact on her father's well-being. When I entered the house, Richard was sitting in his usual chair, looking more worn out than usual. He greeted me with a weak smile, but his eyes reflected a deep sadness. "Ellen, it's good to see you," he said, his voice weary. I sat down beside him, taking his hand in mine. "What happened with the caretaker, Richard? Why did Susan fire her?" He sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. "Susan thinks the caretaker isn't doing enough. She's been very stressed lately, taking on more than she can handle." I tried to intervene, but Susan can be quite stubborn. I felt a surge of anger mixed with sadness. Richard needed consistent care, and Susan's behavior was jeopardizing his health. I couldn't understand why she would dismiss someone who had been doing their job well, especially when Richard's condition required professional attention. Over the next few weeks I noticed a decline in Richard's health. Without a dedicated caretaker, the burden fell entirely on Susan, who seemed increasingly overwhelmed and irritable. Every time I visited, Richard appeared more fatigued, and the atmosphere in the house was tense. Susan's presence, or rather, her absence, loomed over everything, a constant source of stress. One day, I decided to have a candid conversation with Richard. I needed to understand what was happening and how I could help. We sat in the living room, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. "Richard, I'm worried about you," I began gently. "You need proper care, and with the caretaker gone, I'm not sure you're getting it. What can we do to make things better?" He looked at me, his eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude and resignation. "Ellen, I appreciate your concern. I really do. But Susan insists on handling things herself. She feels it's her responsibility." I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "But it's clear she's struggling. Maybe we can find a compromise? Another caretaker? Someone Susan approves of?" Richard shook his head slowly. "I've tried suggesting that, but Susan is very particular. She doesn't trust easily, and she's determined to do things her way." The conversation left me feeling helpless. I wanted to support Richard, but Susan's interference made it nearly impossible. My visits continued, each one filled with a growing sense of frustration and concern. Richard's health was deteriorating, and Susan's handling of the situation was only making things worse. One evening, as I was leaving Richard's house, I ran into the former caretaker at the grocery store. She looked healthier and more relaxed than the last time I'd seen her, but there was still a lingering sadness in her eyes. I approached her, hoping to gain some insight into what had happened. "Hi, it's good to see you again," I said warmly. "I'm sorry about what happened at Richard's. Can you tell me more about why Susan fired you?" She hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. "Susan is difficult to work with," she finally admitted. "She has very high standards and gets frustrated easily. I tried my best, but nothing seemed to satisfy her. I think she's under a lot of pressure, and it's affecting her judgment." I nodded, absorbing her words. "Thank you for telling me. I just want to make sure Richard is okay. He needs proper care." The caretaker gave me a sad smile. "He does. Just keep an eye on him. And if you can, try to talk to Susan. She needs help too, even if she doesn't realize it." I decided to have a direct conversation with Susan. I called her and suggested meeting to discuss Richard's care. To my surprise, she agreed to meet at a local cafe the next morning. I hoped that a neutral setting would help facilitate a productive conversation. As I arrived at the cafe, I saw Susan already seated, a cup of coffee in front of her. She looked tired, her face etched with stress and fatigue. I took a deep breath and approached her table, determined to keep the conversation focused and constructive. "Good morning, Susan," I greeted her, trying to sound as calm and supportive as possible. "Morning," she replied curtly, barely glancing up from her coffee. I sat down and took a moment to gather my thoughts. "Susan, I've been really worried about your father. His health is declining, and I think we need to find a more sustainable solution for his care. I'd like to recommend hiring a professional nurse." Susan's reaction was immediate and intense. Her eyes flashed with anger, and she leaned forward, her voice low and venomous. "Who the hell do you think you are, Ellen? This is my family, my responsibility. You have no right to interfere. Taken aback by her hostility, I tried to remain composed. Susan, I'm not trying to interfere. I just want to make sure Richard gets the care he needs. This is about his well-being, not about us. She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. Sure, that's what you want everyone to believe. But I know better. You're just worried about his estate, aren't you? Making sure you get a piece of the pie. Her words stung and I felt my face flush with anger. That's not true, and you know it. I care about Richard, and I've been part of his life for 15 years. This is about his health, not his money. Susan's expression hardened, and she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. I don't need your help, Ellen, and I don't need you meddling in our family affairs. Stay out of it. Frustrated and hurt, I took a deep breath, trying to find a way to reach her. Susan, this isn't about control or money. It's about making sure your father is taken care of. We need to work together. But it was clear that Susan was not willing to listen. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. I'm done here. Don't ever talk to me about this again, and stay away from my father's business. With that, she walked out of the cafe, leaving me sitting there, stunned and disheartened. I sat for a while, trying to process the confrontation. My intentions had been genuine, but Susan's accusations and hostility had made it clear that she saw me as a threat rather than an ally. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't help but wonder about Susan's motivations. Her refusal to accept help seemed rooted in something deeper than just distrust of me. I knew her relationship with her mother was strained. Susan had mentioned once, in passing, that her mother had remarried and started a new family, leaving Susan feeling abandoned and redundant. Perhaps her need to control her father's care was a way to assert some sense of importance and stability in her life. 2 weeks had passed since my last visit to Richard. During that time, I had made a conscious decision to step back, to focus on my own life and well-being. It wasn't easy, but I felt that after all the years of navigating the complexities of our relationship and dealing with Susan's hostility, I needed to be a bit selfish. I needed to find my own space and reclaim my independence. The first few days were the hardest. I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt and worry about Richard's condition, but I reminded myself that I had already done so much, and it was time for me to live my life without the constant burden of his declining health and family drama. I immersed myself in hobbies I had neglected, reconnected with old friends, and tried to find joy in the little things again. Slowly, I began to feel a sense of relief and freedom. Then, one evening, my phone rang. It was Richard. My heart skipped a beat as I answered, unsure of what to expect. Hi Richard, I greeted him, trying to keep my voice steady. Ellen, it's good to hear your voice, he replied, but there was a sadness in his tone that I couldn't ignore. I've missed you. You haven't been by to visit. His words hit me hard. I had been so focused on distancing myself that I hadn't considered how my absence might affect him. Despite everything, I still cared deeply for Richard, and the thought of him feeling lonely pained me. I'm sorry, Richard, I said honestly. I've been trying to take some time for myself, to focus on my own life for a bit. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Richard spoke again. I understand, Ellen, but I've been feeling very lonely. Susan often leaves me alone at night, going out and sometimes not coming back until late. I've been having to manage on my own. His words were like a dagger to my heart. I felt a surge of pity and frustration. Susan had assured me she would take care of him, but it seemed she was failing in her responsibilities. I couldn't ignore the pang of guilt that welled up inside me. Richard, I didn't know, I replied, my voice softening. I thought Susan was taking care of you. She tries, but she's not always here, he admitted. I understand you need your own life, but it's been hard without you around. I took a deep breath, grappling with my emotions. Richard, I think maybe we've grown apart. It's been difficult for both of us, and I'm not sure where we stand anymore. His silence spoke volumes. I knew my words were harsh, but they were the truth. Our relationship had been strained for a long time, and the events of the past months had only widened the gap between us. I see, he finally said, his voice tinged with sadness. I just wish things were different. We talked for a little while longer, but the conversation was strained and filled with unspoken words. When we finally said goodbye, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. I had been honest with him, but it didn't make the situation any easier. The days that followed were filled with introspection. I couldn't shake the feeling of pity for Richard, knowing he was often left alone. Despite everything, I still cared deeply for him, and the thought of him suffering weighed heavily on my conscience. I wondered if I had made the right decision by stepping back, or if I had been too selfish. One evening, as I sat in my living room reflecting on everything, I received another call from Richard. This time, his voice was more subdued. Ellen, I know things have been difficult, but I need your help, he said, sounding more vulnerable than I had ever heard him before. Susan has been out almost every night, and I'm struggling. I don't know what to do. His plea tugged at my heartstrings. I knew I couldn't ignore him. Despite the decision to distance myself, I couldn't abandon him completely. I'll come by tomorrow, I said gently. We'll figure something out. The next day I visited Richard. He looked more fragile than ever, and it was clear that he had been struggling. We sat down together, and he opened up about the challenges he had been facing. Susan's behavior had become increasingly erratic, and her absences were taking a toll on him. She often left without explanation, and he was left to fend for himself. I don't know what's gotten into her, Richard said, his voice filled with worry. She used to be so responsible, but now it's like she's avoiding me. I listened, feeling a mixture of frustration and compassion. Susan's actions were unacceptable, and Richard deserved better care. But I also knew that confronting Susan directly would likely lead to more conflict. Richard, I'm going to help you get through this, I said firmly. We'll find a solution together. We discussed various options, including reaching out to other family members and finding additional professional help. I suggested contacting a home care agency to provide more consistent support, and Richard agreed. The following days were busy as I coordinated with care providers and ensured Richard's needs were met. I also spoke with Emily, the nurse who had been helping Richard part-time, and arranged for her to increase her visits. Emily was a godsend, and her presence provided much-needed stability. During this time, I also attempted to reach out to Susan, hoping to address the situation diplomatically. I called her and left messages, but she didn't respond. It was clear that she was avoiding both me and the responsibilities of caring for her father. One evening, while I was at Richard's house, Susan finally returned home. It was late, and she looked disheveled and exhausted. She seemed surprised to see me there, but her surprise quickly turned to anger. What are you doing here? She demanded, her voice sharp. I'm here to help Richard, I replied calmly. He's been struggling, and we need to find a better solution for his care. Susan scoffed, crossing her arms. I don't need your help, Ellen. This is my family, my responsibility. It's clear that you're overwhelmed, Susan, I said gently. There's no shame in asking for help. Richard needs consistent care, and I think we should work together to make sure he gets it. Her eyes flashed with anger. You just want to interfere so you can get your hands on his estate. I know your type. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. This isn't about money, Susan. It's about Richard's well-being. We both care about him, and he deserves the best care possible. Susan's hostility didn't abate, but she didn't argue further. She turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, feeling both frustrated and determined. Recently I focused on reclaiming my own life, but my concern for Richard never truly faded. I still called to check in on him and coordinated with his caregivers to ensure he had everything he needed. Despite our strained relationship and Susan's ongoing hostility, my love for Richard remained steadfast. Last month, while I was out running errands, I received a call from Richard's nurse. Her voice was calm but urgent. Ellen, Richard has had a fall. He's being taken to the hospital now. I thought you should know. My heart raced, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. The drive there felt interminable, my mind racing with worry about Richard's condition. I prayed that he would be okay. When I arrived at the hospital, I rushed to the emergency room. I found Richard lying in a hospital bed, gradually waking up. Relief washed over me as I saw his eyes flutter open. He looked groggy but seemed to be regaining consciousness. Richard, I called softly, stepping closer to his bedside. How are you feeling? He turned his head slowly to look at me, a weak smile forming on his lips. Ellen, you're here, he murmured. I'm okay, I think. Just a bit shaken up. I reached out and gently squeezed his hand. I'm so glad you're awake. You gave us all a scare. As I stood there, holding Richard's hand, the door to the room swung open, and Susan stumbled in. She reeked of alcohol, her movements unsteady and her eyes wild. She glared at me with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. What are you doing here? She slurred, her voice dripping with venom. Haven't you done enough? I tried to remain calm, but her words and the sight of her in such a state were infuriating. Susan, I'm here to check on Richard. He's just had a fall and— Shut up, she screamed, cutting me off. You're always meddling, always trying to interfere. This is my family, not yours. Her words were like a knife to the heart. I had come to help Richard, and here she was, drunk and belligerent, attacking me for caring. The frustration and anger that had been building up inside me for months finally reached a boiling point. Susan, you're drunk. You need to leave, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. This isn't helping anyone. Don't tell me what to do, she shouted, stumbling closer. You're nothing but a selfish, greedy. Before I could stop myself, my hand flew up and I slapped her across the face. The sound echoed in the small hospital room, and for a moment, there was a stunned silence. Susan's eyes widened in shock, and then she lunged at me, but the nurses and a few other visitors quickly intervened, pulling us apart. How dare you? Susan screamed, trying to break free from their grasp. You'll pay for this, you bitch. I stood there, breathing heavily, my hand still stinging from the impact. The room was a blur of chaos and noise, but through it all, I could hear Richard's voice, weak but stern. Ellen, go home, he said, his voice filled with disappointment. You shouldn't have hit her. Just go. His words cut deeper than any of Susan's accusations. I looked at him, my heart breaking. Richard, I'm sorry. I didn't mean— Just go, he repeated, closing his eyes as if to shut out the world. Tears filled my eyes as I turned and walked out of the room. The weight of Richard's disapproval and the confrontation with Susan hung heavily on me. As I left the hospital, I felt a profound sense of loss and sadness. The man I had cared for, loved, and supported for so many years had turned me away, and I didn't know if I could ever repair the damage that had been done. In the days that followed, I kept my distance from Richard and his family. I needed time to process what had happened and to figure out how to move forward. The guilt and sadness were overwhelming, and I struggled to find a way to reconcile my actions with my intentions. One evening, as I sat in my living room, the events replaying in my mind, I received a call from Emily. Her voice was gentle, filled with concern. Ellen, I wanted to check in on you. I heard about what happened at the hospital. I sighed, feeling the weight of the past few days pressing down on me. It's been really hard, Emily. I don't know what to do. Ellen, you've been through a lot. It's understandable that you're feeling this way, but you've always had Richard's best interests at heart. Don't lose sight of that. Her words brought a small measure of comfort, but they didn't erase the pain. Thank you, Emily. I just don't know how to fix this. Sometimes it's not about fixing things, she said softly. Sometimes it's about finding a way to move forward, even if it's not the way you envisioned. I spent the next few days reflecting on Emily's words. I realized that I couldn't change what had happened, but I could decide how to respond. I decided to write a letter to Richard, expressing my feelings and apologizing for my actions. It was the only way I could think of to convey my thoughts without causing more conflict. In the letter, I poured out my heart, explaining the frustration and worry that had driven me to slap Susan. I expressed my regret and apologized for my actions, hoping that Richard would understand my intentions, even if he couldn't forgive my outburst. A few days later, I mailed the letter, feeling a mixture of hope and trepidation. I didn't know if Richard would read it or if it would make any difference, but it was the only way I could think of to reach out to him. In the meantime, I focused on my own well-being. I continued to see friends, pursue hobbies, and take care of myself. It wasn't easy, but I knew I needed to find a way to move forward, even if it meant doing so without Richard in my life. Update. A month had passed. I hadn't heard from Richard or Susan since then, and I had decided to focus on my work and try to put the events behind me. Immersing myself in my job was a way to distract myself from the guilt and sadness that lingered after our falling out. My days became a blur of meetings, deadlines, and tasks that kept my mind occupied, leaving little room for personal reflection. However, life has a way of bringing back unresolved issues when you least expect it. One day, while catching up with a mutual acquaintance, I overheard a conversation that stopped me in my tracks. The acquaintance mentioned, in a hushed tone, that Susan had contracted HIV due to her reckless behavior. The term disease of the century echoed in my mind, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It was a devastating revelation that added a new layer of complexity to everything that had happened. I tried to process this information as I drove home, my mind racing with thoughts and emotions. Susan's illness explained so much about her erratic behavior and her hostility towards me. She had been struggling with a secret burden, one that she had not shared with anyone, least of all her father. The realization that Richard was unaware of his daughter's condition weighed heavily on me. He was already fighting his own health battles, and now his daughter was seeking death as an escape from her pain. As I pulled into my driveway, I felt a sense of dread and despair settle over me. The weight of what I had learned felt unbearable, and I knew that I couldn't couldn't simply ignore it. My heart ached for Richard and Susan, both suffering in their own ways, both isolated in their struggles. The walls of my home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, trapping me with my thoughts and regrets. Over the next few days, I found it increasingly difficult to focus on my work. The knowledge of Susan's illness gnawed at me, making it impossible to concentrate. Each time I sat down at my desk, trying to immerse myself in my tasks, my mind would drift back to that devastating revelation. The weight of what I had learned seemed to press down on my shoulders, making even the simplest tasks feel insurmountable. I replayed our last conversation in my mind over and over again, the harsh words exchanged, the anger that had driven us apart, and the intense frustration that had boiled over into that confrontation. Knowing what I knew now, I felt a profound sense of guilt. Had I been too harsh? Had I failed to see the signs of her suffering? These questions haunted me, eroding my sense of peace and leaving me feeling helpless and conflicted. Every glance at my computer screen or stack of papers brought a pang of guilt. The emails and deadlines that once seemed so important now felt trivial in the face of Susan's struggle. My mind wandered back to that fateful day at the hospital, the look of pain in Susan's eyes, and the bitter accusations we had hurled at each other. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much pain she must have been in, pain that I had failed to recognize. It was clear to me that while Richard was struggling with his illness, his daughter was fighting her own battle, one that was equally devastating. Susan's reckless behavior, her late-night escapades, and her erratic absences were not just signs of irresponsibility. They were cries for help, symptoms of a deeper, more insidious pain that she had been hiding from everyone, including herself. The realization that she had been seeking death to escape her suffering was almost too much to bear. It was a stark reminder of the profound impact that our actions and relationships can have on those around us. As I reflected on this, I began to understand the broader implications of what I had learned. It was only then that I truly grasped how the relationship between husband and wife greatly affects the children's perception. Richard and his ex-wife's tumultuous relationship, their bitter divorce, and the emotional fallout had all left deep scars on Susan. She had grown up in an environment where love and support were conditional, where trust had been broken, and where emotional wounds had never truly healed. The dysfunction in Richard's marriage had created a ripple effect, shaping Susan's perceptions and behaviors in ways that were now painfully evident. Her desperate attempts to escape her reality, her anger, and her fear were all rooted in the experiences of her past. She had watched her parents' relationship fall apart, had felt the sting of abandonment from her mother, and had struggled to find her place in a world that seemed to offer no solace. As these realizations settled in, I felt a growing sense of responsibility. I couldn't change the past, but I could try to make amends for my part in the present. Susan needed support and understanding, not judgment and criticism. Richard needed to know the truth about his daughter's struggles so that he could be there for her in a meaningful way. But how could I approach this delicate situation without causing more harm?